Can you tell a bit about yourself and for how long have you been active in this field of medical cannabis?
I work in a cancer institute in a government hospital, primarily in the field of palliative care. My first experience of using cannabis in a medical context was around 2009, maybe something like that, with several patients who received cannabis in the context of a medical situation where they were suffering terribly and they had used up all the possible medical interventions available. I remember especially one patient, he was one step before committing suicide. After he started using cannabis, his whole life changed dramatically to the extent that he embraced life again. He wanted to continue living and functioning. And till this day, he's doing much better. He's not healed. That in his case, it was not a problem that had to do anything with cancer. He had a stroke, a very severe stroke, and he had been suffering for around 5 years from various symptoms associated with it. He was paralyzed completely on his left side, and the muscles were spastic and painful. And in addition, because of damage to certain structures in the brain, he was also suffering of panic attacks. And his doctor, his psychiatrist, tried every possible treatment. She tried 18 different drugs to help him with his panic attacks, and nothing worked. That was really at the beginning of all those things, and I had samples of cannabis. So I gave him 2 joints, and I told him to go home and to take 2 puffs. Mm-hmm. And then after that, after several hours or the day after, to report to me and tell me what kind of effect it had. So the next day, his wife calls me up. She was there with him because he wasn't independent at all. She calls up and says, "Doctor, I don't know what to do. My husband is sitting in the chair and he's not moving, he's not saying anything, he's not responsive. What should I do?" So I asked her, "Tell me, what did he take?" He said, "He took that cannabis that you gave him." He said, "Yes." "How much?" She said, "Only 1 cigarette. He smoked only 1 cigarette." I said, "Yeah." I said, 2 puffs, not 1 cigarette. He's stoned. It's okay. Just let him sit there. It'll gradually go away. Mm-hmm. Next day, tell him to take only 2 puffs and then see what happens. And the next day she calls up again. And she says, "You know, it makes your hairs stand on edge." She says, "Doctor, I could kiss your feet. I haven't seen my husband like this for so many years. He is relaxed. There's no pain. He's feeling much better. It's something I never believed I would live to see that again."
Mm-hmm. It seems like cannabis works on the whole body. It improves our quality of life, actually.
I prefer to tell you what was observed. The facts themselves, the observations, have value in themselves. And this is an observation nobody can deny. He was doing much better, and he kept on using the cannabis after that. Among other things, he stopped having panic attacks. And if he felt that a panic attack was coming, he would take 2 puffs and it would stop the panic. Just like that. So this is not the only way or the best treatment for all panic disorders or whatever. But, I mean, this is a direct report of what happened. That's completely undeniable. And there was no other way to help him have this relief. So for him, it was life or death, mm-hmm. practically, getting the cannabis. And under such circumstances, if a doctor says no, there's no medical, no scientific background, nothing to prove that this is the right thing to do, I mean, it's unacceptable. Because that would have put him back into the situation he was before and robbed him of his life, which turned out to be accessible to an extent. This is a very strong dilemma, especially when you enter into situations where you have a confrontation with the authorities. because the authorities say it is not permitted, but the authorities also say that you are responsible for the person's health and well-being. So not to give it to him and then have him commit suicide, is that better? Is that something that the health authorities think is okay? Well, you don't know. It's really a dilemma. Who are you more committed to? The regulations that dictate what can and cannot be done formally, or to the well-being which you observe directly of the patient?
Do you think this is a question of human rights?
Among other things, definitely. I mean, everybody has a right to have some access to such relief. Definitely, if it's proven to be available. It's not a hypothesis. I'm not saying maybe it will help him. He's getting it, and you can see with your own eyes what the difference is.
But I think it's one of most important messages from your lecture before, that cannabis is safe. The possible side effects are reversible, you said.
When you evaluate the safety of a drug, you compare it. It is not something out there in empty space, okay? And all the patients say, the doctor will give me morphine. If I don't take the cannabis, he will give me morphine. Now, we know how dangerous morphine is, and you know how much you can become addicted if you take it on a regular basis, even if it is only to control your symptoms. It is a problem. You get constipated, you get depressed, it changes it affects many, many aspects in an undesirable manner. Nobody in the world would say that morphine is safer than cannabis. Nobody in the world would say that they know what the long-term effects of taking morphine on a regular basis are expected to be. It hasn't been examined formally. You know from experience that the effects are not necessarily so good. And if you compare the cannabis to morphine, if you compare the safety of cannabis to antidepressants, etc., then obviously cannabis comes out on the better side, even an association of higher mortality with the use of antidepressants.
Which diseases you treat with medical cannabis? What is, let's say, available for patients?
The State of Israel has done one thing, and I actually was in a rather unique situation. I was quite early on, towards the end of 2010, one of only a handful of doctors who had the authority to actually give the permits directly to the patient. The other ones had to write letters to representatives of the Ministry of Health and get authorization. It was a whole bureaucratic procedure before the patients got the cannabis. So it was much easier for me to provide my patients with the cannabis, and obviously I could treat them for all kinds of conditions which otherwise could not get such effective treatment. The cannabis is unique in its ability to control certain symptoms as compared to other medications which are available nowadays. For example, with stress and anxiety, patients could not sleep just because of their anxiety after they were told that they have cancer. I'm not talking about other things like the discomfort that they have during the treatment that they're getting, the chemotherapy. Patients who get the cannabis effectively in the right dose of the right variety, they felt much better than the people who were getting the same treatment on their right and on their left. And they really couldn't understand how the other people weren't taking it as well. And that's a consistent observation, even with the most modern antiemetic treatment.
The evidences of controlled clinical trials are far behind the evidences in practice.
Of course. Now, in Israel, you asked me before, what are people getting cannabis and what aren't they getting it for?
Yeah.
So by 2013, they issued a list of diagnoses which serve as an indication to offer cannabis as treatment. Generally, the approach is that the use of cannabis is only the last resort. That is, you have to use every other possible standard medicine intervention before you can offer the cannabis. Even if it's more dangerous than cannabis, you first, like for inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, what they have written down formally is that a patient first has to undergo surgery before they offer cannabis, and it doesn't make sense, but that's what's written down for various reasons. They really want to make it the last resort after everything, all the possibilities have been exhausted. That's a matter of policy. Also, despite everything we say nowadays about respecting patients' rights and everything, that's one of the ridiculous things, We have our patients sign a consent to get chemotherapy, and they tell you, look, chemotherapy is like this and that, it can help you in so and so many percent of the cases, but there is also this risk and that risk for hospitalization and even of death. But you are a grown-up person. Now I have explained all these details to you, and it's your responsibility to decide if you take the chemotherapy or you don't take it. If the people don't sign, they will not get chemotherapy. It is their responsibility, because according to this bureaucratic system, they are grown-up people who can make decisions about life and death on their own. With cannabis, the opposite happens. The patients come in, they say, look, I haven't even tried it. I know that it is good for me. I am a grown-up. I don't want morphine. I refuse to get it. It is you can't force me to take it. This is what I want. This is what suits me best. And all of a sudden they are not treated as grown-ups who have a mind of their own and can decide what they're going to do with their body. All of a sudden there are subjects, and the system will dictate to them what they can and cannot do. From a rational point of view, it doesn't make much sense. Depends from what perspective. I mean, if you are someone interested in a government that can control everything, then maybe it is logical from some kind of perspective, but it's not rational from the perspective of human rights and basic ethics, I could say.
Local growers are your providers?
Yeah, formally authorized growers who are growing with a permit from the government.
What do you think are benefits of local production?
I mean, where else would it come from? To import it? Why shouldn't you import something that you can grow on your own? I mean,
it was suggested here in Slovenia, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, of course. It's easier to control what's being grown if you know exactly who is the grower, how he is growing it. You can go and supervise even. You can make sure that they're not spraying it with all kinds of insecticides, pesticides or whatever. You have much more control. Essentially, you could also import products from abroad, but then these are technical issues. I mean, the fact is, in Israel, it's also a problem. So the local growers have to comply with so many rules regarding security and making sure that nobody can come and steal it and use it illegally, that it makes the cannabis much more expensive and inaccessible, actually, or actually inflicts a lot of financial losses on these companies. It's all dynamic now in Israel. It's changing as things go, and actually all of these companies are making their income and surviving on operations outside of Israel. And in Israel, they're just doing it for the benefit of the population and for other reasons as well.
It all started in Israel when Raphael Mishulam isolated THC, and then consequently endocannabinoid system was discovered.
It's a certain aspect of physiology, of biology of organisms, which has gradually, bit by bit, being researched and elaborated, investigated. It's not like discovering America.
Can we say that endocannabinoid system is an organic physiological system in our bodies?
Very much so. I mean,
why is, after all, this discovery important for humanity?
Because, as it was said here today, mentioned in several lectures, it is a major mechanism regulating multiple functions in the organism. Clearly modifies our function in so many aspects. It is important, there's no question about that.
Do you think it's important for doctor who treats patients with cannabis to be professionally qualified about the endocannabinoid system? Or do you think can any doctor prescribe cannabis?
That has something to do with philosophy, professional philosophy in general. I mean, how you see what a doctor can do and cannot do. If he has read enough and he is well aware of what he is doing, then he formally he's permitted to do it. So every doctor has to sort of take the responsibility on himself, and it depends on the circumstances. Like I introduced a certain pain drug into the hospital. I didn't have extensive experience with that drug, but there was a patient with no other option, and there was no one else to help me with it. So I took that leap and I made the decision and I read about it and I gave it to the patient. The doctor has a responsibility.
You don't have an official education for doctors who decide to work with medical cannabis?
It's good if there is a formal system of providing a certain basis of knowledge, but it is not essential. I mean, the question is what the alternative is. If the doctor does not have the qualification and the patients then will not have access to something that is the only thing that can help them, then that doesn't make sense. Let the doctor read up and make use of it. If there is a possibility to gain such education, so much the better. I mean, the question really is not if there is a piece of a diploma on the wall. That is always true, although we live in a formal society where such diplomas are often required. That's up to the regulators, really, but it's not of essence, actually, to making use, to exploiting the benefits that are in the cannabis.
What do you think is most important for kind of efficient, successful cannabis treatment?
Look, it's quite obvious. It's communication and trust. If there's no trust, then there's no medicine. That full stop, that's obvious. And then beyond that, if the communication is good, then it should be possible for any doctor to make use of cannabis, especially taking into consideration its relative safety. There are other drugs which are much more dangerous, then perhaps some restrictions regarding its use are more important.
All the speakers, you were talking about the entourage effect.
You can take it at face value, it's an observation. You give all the components of the plant as we know it nowadays. We do not know of any isolated component of the plant which will provide a similar effect.
If all the components are working synergetically, and if the natural extracts of the whole plant are more effective, then I'm wondering, does it make sense to produce single isolated cannabinoids?
It's a big question. It's a big question. What can I say? I mean, these are things that still have to be demonstrated. Okay, there is a lot of logic to try to produce things on an industrial level because we can't commit all the diminishing reserves of agricultural land only to growing cannabis, so there'll be enough to produce cannabis for all humanity. So it would be good if we could produce the effective cannabinoids otherwise, from that perspective.
Just like public information, what is, let's say, a good prevention for healthy endocannabinoid system?
To be happy and live well. The functioning of this endocannabinoid activity is related to the circumstances, and it responds. I mean, classical examples is that if you do exercise, and after the exercise, the level of 2-AG will rise significantly in your bloodstream. Just goes to show you that there are physiological ways to affect the profile of the endocannabinoid activity.
Do you think that cannabis could be also some basic nutrition, considering all the vitamins and minerals?
It's affected by nutrition, there's no question about it.
What is the future of cannabis in medicine, and what do you suggest to Slovenian colleagues?
We'll have to wait and see, I think. And everybody does what he does according to his commitments, according to his beliefs. It seems nowadays that there is a tendency to develop in the direction of making more use of cannabis and cannabis-based interventions. Well, but we'll have to live and see it.
Right. Thank you very much.